When the anxious walks away, the avoidance nightmare begins. For so long, the anxious partner carries the weight of the relationship. They overcommunicate, they overexplain, they overtry. They are the ones who send the long texts, who try to fix the silence, who show up even when they're hurting, and the avoidant learns subconsciously that no matter how much distance they create, the anxious will chase them. But here's the twist. When the anxious finally gets tired, when they decide to protect their own peace, when they walk away, that's the moment the avoidance illusion of control collapses. Suddenly, the silence is no longer theirs to dictate. The anxious is no longer waiting by the phone. They are no longer begging for scraps of attention. They have realized that their energy is valuable, and they've stopped pouring it into someone who cannot meet them halfway. And that shift is terrifying for the avoidant because the power dynamic flips. The one they thought would never leave is gone. The anxious walking away is not just an exit, it's a revelation. It's proof that love should never be one-sided. It's a reminder that the one who chases can also choose to stop chasing, and that decision carries more weight than all the avoidant's silent withdrawals combined. So, when the anxious walks away, the avoidance nightmare begins. Not because they've lost someone who needed them, but because they've lost someone who loved them deeply, someone who was willing to fight for the relationship, someone they may never find again. The anxious partner often carries the emotional weight of the relationship until they no longer can. In the beginning, they are the one who gives and gives because their deepest fear is losing connection. They show up consistently, they check in, they try to soothe misunderstandings, and they anticipate the needs of the other person. Their whole focus is on keeping the bond alive, even if it means sacrificing their own peace. They are the ones who try to bridge every gap, to close every distance, to heal every silence. And in doing so, they start to carry not just their own emotions, but also the unspoken weight of their partner's fears, insecurities, and avoidance. It's as if the relationship becomes a one-sided effort where they are constantly investing energy, trying to hold everything together with their love and persistence. But over time, this imbalance becomes exhausting. The anxious person begins to feel that no matter how much they give, it is never truly reciprocated. Their reassurances are not met with reassurance in return. Their vulnerability is not matched with openness, and their effort does not create lasting closeness. Instead, they often encounter walls, distance, or emotional shutdowns. At first, they explain this away, telling themselves to be more patient, to try harder, or to love a little louder. But with every repeated cycle of giving without receiving, they start to feel invisible, as though their needs don't matter. The very thing they fear most, abandonment, starts to feel like it's happening in slow motion, not because the other person left, but because they refuse to truly show up. Carrying the emotional weight of two people takes a toll. The anxious partner finds themselves drained, anxious, and often questioning their own worth. They wonder if maybe they are asking for too much, when in reality, what they want is basic connection, reassurance, love, and partnership. They carry this inner battle quietly, convincing themselves to stay hopeful because the love they feel is real, and they want to believe the other person is capable of meeting them halfway. But there comes a point when hope is no longer enough. The anxiety shifts into clarity, a realization that they cannot continue to pour from an empty cup. They begin to see that while they have been carrying the relationship, the other person has been standing still, taking the effort for granted. It is at this breaking point that everything changes. The anxious person no longer has the strength to keep carrying both sets of emotions. They recognize that the responsibility to build intimacy cannot fall entirely on one person's shoulders. When this truth sets in, the anxious partner doesn't explode or lash out. Instead, they quietly begin to detach. They stop explaining, stop justifying, stop begging for closeness. And that silence, after so much effort, is the loudest statement they could ever make. It marks the end of carrying the relationship alone and the beginning of reclaiming their own energy and self-worth. walking away is the anxious person's most powerful act of self-respect. For so long, they have given their energy, their time, and their heart in an attempt to hold on to the relationship. They've been the one to reach out after an argument, to extend an olive branch when silence stretches too long, to make sense of mixed signals that leave them spinning. They've tolerated inconsistency, convinced themselves to be patient, and fought for love even when they felt they were fighting alone. Every step of the way, they have tried to prove that they are worthy of closeness, of affection, of being chosen. And yet, deep down, they often feel like their love is not truly received, or worse, that their effort is being taken for granted. The act of walking away does not come easily for them. It comes after they have exhausted every possible path of holding on. When the anxious person finally decides to step back, it is not about punishing the other person or playing games. It is a quiet declaration that they deserve more than crumbs of attention. It is a recognition that chasing someone who consistently pulls away does not build intimacy, but erodes their own sense of self. By walking away, they are not saying, "I don't care." They are saying, "I care too much about myself to stay in a cycle that keeps hurting me." That shift from chasing validation to reclaiming self-worth is what makes walking away so powerful. It is no longer about waiting for the avoidant partner to change. It is about choosing themselves, even if it means facing the fear of being alone. The power of this act lies in its finality. The anxious person, who once bent over backwards to keep the bond intact, no longer feels compelled to do so. They have realized that their love cannot survive on effort alone. They understand that connection is only meaningful if it is mutual, and they are no longer willing to sacrifice their own emotional health for a relationship that leaves them depleted. This realization transforms the act of walking away into something more than just leaving. It becomes a reclaiming of their voice, their dignity, and their boundaries. What makes it even more powerful is that the avoidant often doesn't see it coming. They are used to the anxious partner being the one who returns, who forgives, who keeps knocking on the closed door. When that pattern breaks, the dynamic of the relationship shifts dramatically. Suddenly, the anxious is no longer waiting, no longer chasing, no longer trying to fix what isn't theirs to fix. That absence of pursuit is louder than any argument, clearer than any plea. It is a statement that says, "I will no longer abandon myself to keep you comfortable." In this way, walking away becomes a form of liberation. It is not an act of bitterness, but of clarity. It is the anxious person finally choosing to give the love they kept offering to someone else back to themselves. And in that choice lies their greatest strength, the ability to stop begging for love and to start embodying it within their own life. The avoidance illusion of control shatters when the anxious stops chasing. For a long time, the avoidant partner often believes they hold the upper hand in the dynamic. By pulling away, withdrawing emotionally, or creating distance, they feel they dictate the rhythm of the relationship. They assume the anxious person will always reach out, always try to bridge the silence, and always return no matter how far they push them away. This belief creates a false sense of security, as though the anxious partner's loyalty is endless and unconditional. In that illusion, the avoidant feels in control, because the anxious person's fear of losing the relationship keeps them tethered to the cycle of pursuit. But control built on someone else's fear is fragile, and it begins to crack the moment the anxious realizes that their chasing is only hurting them. When the anxious partner reaches the point of exhaustion, something fundamental shifts. They are no longer willing to be the emotional anchor for two people. They stop explaining, stop pleading, and stop trying to decode the avoidance walls. Instead of running after distance, they begin to step back and redirect their energy inward. To the avoidant, this silence feels different than before. It is not the silence of someone waiting, it is the silence of someone who has finally detached, and in that moment, the control they thought they had evaporates. The avoidant no longer dictates the timing or the pace of the connection. Instead, they are faced with the unsettling truth that the anxious partner is gone, not just physically, but emotionally. This is where the nightmare begins for the avoidant. They realize that the very behavior they used to create safety for themselves, pulling away, has now led to the loss of the one person who fought hardest to stay. The absence of pursuit creates a void, and suddenly the avoidant is confronted with their own silence echoing back at them. The anxious person's presence, once a guarantee, becomes a memory. That shift exposes how little real control the avoidant ever had. Their strategy of withdrawal may have bought them space, but it also eroded the very connection they secretly craved yet feared. The collapse of this illusion forces the avoidant to face themselves. Without the anxious chasing, they must finally sit with the discomfort of their own distance. There is no distraction, no one knocking on the closed door, no reassurance waiting on the other side. The anxious walking away highlights what the avoidant tried to deny, that relationships cannot thrive on one person's effort, and that control is not connection. The truth hits hardest when the avoidant realizes that the love they once dismissed or minimized was rare, loyal, and deeply genuine. In the end, the illusion of control was never real. The anxious person was never trapped. They were choosing to stay again and again because of love. And when they finally stop choosing, the avoidant is left with the stark reality that their silence no longer commands power. It only reveals loss. Silence becomes the avoidant's prison, not the anxious person's punishment. For much of the relationship, silence has been the avoidant's weapon of choice. It has been their shield when emotions ran too high, their escape when closeness felt suffocating, their way of maintaining control without saying a word. For the anxious partner, that silence was always a trigger. It was a loud reminder of their worst fear, that they were unworthy, unloved, or on the verge of being abandoned. So they tried to fill the gaps, to break through the walls, to make the silence less unbearable by pouring more words, more affection, more effort into the void. And for a time, that dynamic reinforced the avoidant's sense of safety. They could retreat whenever they wished, knowing the anxious would bridge the distance. But this cycle doesn't last forever. There comes a moment when the anxious person grows tired of fighting against silence. They begin to realize that their constant reaching out doesn't create closeness, but instead deepens their own pain. In that awareness, something shifts. Instead of fearing silence, they start to embrace it. They see it not as abandonment, but as clarity, a clear sign that their needs are not being met. Slowly, they stop chasing, stop over-explaining, stop overextending themselves in the hope of breaking through the walls. They choose quiet, not out of fear but out of strength, and suddenly silence no longer belongs to the avoidant. It belongs to the anxious who has reclaimed it as a tool of peace. This is when silence turns into a prison for the avoidant. The very space they once relied on for safety now becomes unbearable. With no anxious partner rushing in to bridge the gap, they are left with the emptiness they created. The silence, once a source of control, becomes a mirror reflecting back everything they tried to avoid. Their fear of intimacy, their resistance to vulnerability, and ultimately their own loneliness. The quiet that used to feel protective now feels suffocating because it is no longer temporary. It is the new reality. The anxious partner has stopped knocking on the door, and the avoidant is left inside their fortress with no one coming to rescue them from the isolation they built. This shift is devastating because the avoidant begins to realize that silence does not equal freedom. It equals absence. The anxious person's laughter, their texts, their reassurance, their constant presence, all of it disappears into the quiet. And the avoidant, who once relied on the certainty of being pursued, is left with nothing but their own echo. What once felt like control becomes a stark reminder of loss. In this way, silence flips its meaning. It is no longer the anxious person's burden but their boundary. It signals the end of overextending and the beginning of self-respect. For the avoidant, however, it becomes the cage that keeps them trapped with the truth they've been running from, that love cannot survive in isolation, and that the silence they once weaponized has become the very thing that exposes what they've lost. Losing someone who once fought for them is the avoidant's deepest regret. In the early stages of the relationship, the avoidant often underestimates the value of the anxious partner's love. They may see the chasing, the reassurance, and the constant effort as something guaranteed, something that will never run out. To the avoidant, it can feel overwhelming at times, but deep down they grow accustomed to it. They rely on the anxious person's persistence, on their willingness to bridge every gap, to forgive every withdrawal, and to keep showing up no matter how many times the avoidant pulled away. It creates a quiet belief that the anxious will always be there, no matter how distant or unresponsive they are in return. But that belief is a dangerous illusion, because even the most loyal and loving person reaches a point of exhaustion where they no longer have the energy to fight for two. When the anxious finally walks away, the avoidant is left facing a reality they never prepared for. They may not realize the depth of what they had until it is gone. All the little things they once took for granted, the constant texts, the thoughtful gestures, the reassurance, the unwavering loyalty, suddenly become glaring in their absence. The avoidant is confronted with the fact that what they dismissed as too much was in fact a rare kind of devotion, one that most people long for but never find. Losing it is not just losing a partner, it is losing someone who truly believed in them, someone who saw beyond their walls and tried to love them despite the distance. That kind of loss does not fade quickly. It lingers heavy and haunting. Regret sets in when the avoidant realizes that no one else will fight for them in the same way. New connections may come, but they lack the same depth, the same intensity, the same patience that the anxious partner carried. The avoidant begins to see that what they once perceived as pressure was actually love in its purest form, a desire for closeness, for connection, for shared vulnerability. And when they reflect on how many times they pushed it away, the regret deepens. They understand that they didn't just lose a person, they lost an opportunity to grow, to heal, and to experience intimacy in a way that could have changed their life. This regret often arrives too late. By the time the anxious has chosen themselves and built a new life of peace and self-respect, they rarely look back. They no longer wish to reopen old wounds or return to the same cycle of giving without receiving. The avoidant is left watching from a distance, realizing that their silence, their withdrawals, and their fear of closeness cost them someone irreplaceable. The memory of the anxious person's love becomes bittersweet, a reminder of what they had, what they resisted, and what they lost forever. And it is in that realization that the avoidant discovers the cruel truth. Losing someone who once fought for them is not just painful, it is a regret that shadows them long after the relationship is gone. And so, when the anxious finally walks away, everything changes. The illusion of control collapses, silence loses its power, and the deepest regret settles in for the avoidant who never thought they'd lose someone who fought so hard for them. This is not just a story about endings, but about transformation, about one person rediscovering their worth and choosing peace over pain. Thank you for listening, and I hope these words remind you to never undervalue your love that shows up, to cherish it while you have it, and above all, to never forget your own worth.